Hello everyone, welcome to World Building panel. We are still missing two guests, but I think we shall start. And a little bit of introduction from me. As we all know, world building is an essential part while creating a fiction, any fiction at all. And we may distinguish two different approaches while the world building is considered. I think the first one is the top-down approach. I think that our guests will comment later on that, where we create a general picture of the geography, of the landscape, and then we go down to the very details. Other approach is that we take a part of land and we tend to build a world around it. Both approaches have their pros and cons, and I think that I will pass on to Peter, maybe, for start. What is your approach when you think about a new world that you want to create? What do you think about first?
Hi, everyone. I'm Peter V. Brett. Thank you for coming. I can't believe how many people are here. I'm not nervous, not at all. I want to say before I start, I know there are probably a lot of you here who are looking to be writers or are already writers, and so I want to say right from the beginning, there's no right or wrong answer to this question, and you will have to find out for yourself what works best for you. Everyone's mind is different and everyone writes differently, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about what works for us, and maybe that will help you, but you don't have to listen if you don't want to. That said, I plan everything meticulously before I start writing a book. It's probably why my books take so long to come out. When I plot out a book, I write about 200 pages of outline that breaks down every single thing that happens in the book. And I will stop when a character reaches a place that I haven't really thought about before. I will stop my work and think about that area and think about who the key people are and what the key places are. And I know all of that stuff before I start writing the prose, so that when I write the prose, I can focus on how do the characters feel about what's going on. I already know what's going to happen. I already know who they're going to encounter. And then I can focus on what are they feeling right now, how are they interacting with people, and so that you can feel like you're the character. I want the reader to feel like they're living what's going on. And so I focus on the feelings when I do the prose writing, and behind the scenes, I do all of the other work. But that said, it doesn't mean that I built the entire world from the beginning of the series. You build it as you need it. So you don't just come up with characters and then come up with a world, or you don't just come up with world and then design your characters. They have to grow together. So that's my piece. I'll pass it on. I've been talking for too long. You're the moderator.
Yeah, Patricia, what about you? Like, what are the first thoughts regarding the prose, the world you're creating in your novels?
Okay, I'm Patty Briggs. Hi. Patricia.
Huge applause,
names,
guys.
Shortening names when you go from... Thank you. So shortening your name when you go from one country to the other is kind of rife with trouble, too. So I'm Patricia Briggs, but I usually go by Patty. So...
or Brad.
Or I heard you, Anne. That's my trusty assistant. If you write to me, you usually hear from Anne first because she's smarter and funnier than I am. I write the through the mist fashion. I like that better than pantser, but it really is a pantser method. And what I mean by that is that I do my planning as I'm running along. So I start with the characters, and I put the characters together, and then the story takes place based on what the characters decide to do, given the situation. That doesn't mean I don't do world building outside of that. and it depends on what kind of a story I'm working on. When I was doing traditional fantasy stories, I did a lot more world building ahead of time. And now that I do urban fantasy stories, the world building I do all the time. Because I walk through life and go, oh, that would be really cool. I wonder what would happen if you throw werewolves and vampires there. And right? So the world building is in some ways less creative, and in some ways much more creative than working out a fantasy world. So, because I'm dealing with the real world only, then I add vampires and werewolves and fae and whatever else comes to mind as I throw it in and see what people will do with it. And I have a lot of fun. But I wish I could tell you there was a magic one way to do things. I've heard authors get up and say there's only one way to do things, and I immediately quit listening to them because I know they're wrong. Because that's the one rule about writing, is that there are no real rules about writing that work.
I totally disagree. This woman is full of
I know, right?
Rebel, welcome.
I apologize for being so late. I was signing books, and there were like 6 people left in the line, and I didn't want to run away. So, thank you for waiting.
And now I would like to pass the voice to Graham. And what are your first thoughts regarding the world building, if you consider a new plot, for example?
Hello again, Poland. It's so nice to be back. I always feel like I'm at home in Poland. Thank you, I really do. I come 2 or 3 times a year, but this particular festival is one of my favorites, and it's really, really nice to be back. Thank you so much for coming. I have, to world building, I have a lot of different approaches, because rather like Patty there, I don't plan my books very much in advance. I have a basic idea of what's going to happen in the book, but it is, as she says, it's the characters that lead the story, and sometimes a new character will appear and change the whole story completely. And lead you down another path altogether. As far as the world in which these things exist is concerned, I've done so many different books. I've done historical books which are set in a historical setting. I've recently done some crime books that are set in London in 1750. And so what I had to do is find maps of London in 1750 and engravings and drawings and try and imagine through pictures and through the maps what that world was like, and also try and find accounts from people who lived in those days to see exactly how the place... London smelled in those days. I mean, there were no sewers. Any sewage used to run down the middle of the road. And if somebody gutted a sheep, they'd chuck the guts into the middle of the road. So you can build that world out of people's real experiences and historical people's real experiences, and that's great fun to do. But it does take a lot of research. But I don't research it beforehand. I do it as it go along. I like it that way. I know you like to plan in advance, but I like to surprise myself, because I'd get a bit bored if I knew what was going to happen in the book in the end. You know, I like to get to the end and suddenly find that the world that I've built has surprised me and come up with it. It's a bit like being a clockmaker and having a whole lot of cogs and springs in front of you. And as the story goes along, you put them all together bit by bit. And you often surprise yourself by something that you've written right at the beginning and you didn't know why you wrote it. Suddenly gives the answer to the whole story in the end. One of the things that I try and do these days, I have written about completely fantasy worlds, but is using realistic backgrounds. The most recent example was when I lived in Ireland, in Cork, in Southern Ireland, and that gave me the inspiration for writing very, very gory crime thrillers. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to write crime, but I didn't want to leave my horror audience behind, because they were always so loyal and really helped me. But Cork is a fascinating, absolutely fascinating place, and to recreate it in a book, to build the real cork into a fiction story was a great challenge. I mean, it's a very odd place, Cork. In Dublin, they speak they say they speak the best English of all in Dublin. You go down to Cork, you can't understand what the hell they're talking about. It's all like that. Hello, boy. How you doing? If it doesn't matter what age you are, you're boy, or your girl. Hi, girl. How you doing there? And the logic is apart from just the whole scenery around. It's built on the River Lee between two branches of the river, which always comes into the story. But the logic in Cork, and it's part of the world in which they live. They say things. I heard a woman in a pub say, will you go and buy me 10 kilos of potatoes? But don't get the big ones because they're too heavy to carry. And that's part of the world that you create. It's part of their logic and part of their humour and things like that. But and the city around as well. Anyway, I'm burbling on, and I could go on forever about the different worlds that I've managed to create. I've created totally fantasy worlds, like worlds in dreams, like deserts and Bedouin tents in dreams, and clockwork cities where all the trains have to be wound up with keys. But what I always try and do is just make it as realistic as possible, so that when the characters come into life, and the story comes into life, you can make the story quite fantastic because the world that you've built is so believable. Anyway, I'll pass you on now.
I've listened to him for 2 minutes, and I want to go out and buy every one of his books. I really love the metaphor of being like a clockmaker, and I think that we have very similar styles of world building, in that I start with the characters, and then the pieces of the world fall into place around the character, and frequently they take over the story and they run the story, and it goes places that were certainly never in any outline that I attempted to create. But then again, every outline I've ever written, by the time I finish the book, I could take that outline and write that book, and it would be a completely different story from what I've wound up with.
I don't know why you people think writing is fun.
And since Graham mentioned the visuals like maps, do you use something other than text that would help you to create the world in your novels? Patricia, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two experiences. First, when I write traditional fantasy, quite often I will do a sketched out map, so I know how far it is between different places and how long it takes to travel places, so that I don't contradict myself later on in the book. And when I'm writing the Mercy books, the Tri-Cities is a real place. So I go places, and I'll drive around with my trusty assistant and the camera and she just said it, so the police officers will say, "Can I help you, ladies?" Stop. There we go. Okay. So there's a bridge, a cable bridge in the Tri-Cities that I destroyed in a. I think there. It's going in and out. It doesn't like me. Okay, so there's a bridge that I was working on that have a troll on, that there's a battle, and I had to go out there and actually physically walk, even though I know all the dimensions of the bridge. I had to go out there and is it?
Yeah,
Does anyone have salt or something like?
Right. I need to toss it over my shoulder. Wrong shoulder. Sorry, left shoulder. So I had to go out and physically walk the bridge so that I could do the blocking for the fight with the troll, how big the troll was. It's really tempting when you're world building. You go, oh, it's a big creature. How big? It's really, really, really big. And then you actually start doing the biological background of it, and you go, oh, no, it can't be that big. So I made it about the size of an elephant, and then I would have to envision an elephant and what it would look like next to cars, and what it would look like next to the bridge, so that I could do the scene realistically. And I realized things like you can't see one side of the bridge from the other side of the bridge because it arcs over and it's a mile long. So they could hear the creature on one side, and then you could hear it on the other side, and I had a lot of fun with that. But that's so that's mapping in real time. But I do have a map of the Tri-Cities that I look at and that I track. And then I have this wonderful friend of mine who draws the maps, and a lot of the books will have a map in it, depending on how his life story is going. And he's terrific. He does all those by hand and little figures by hand. He's pretty awesome.
Peter, you can comment on that?
So there's quite a lot of things that I use in addition to my notes. I have a what I call an appendix file for my world that's about probably close to 300 pages now, that has every single person, place, or thing that I've ever created in the world. I immediately write them down and add them to this file in alphabetical order so I can find it later. But in addition to that, I started out my career in the arts doing pen and ink drawings, very bad pen and ink drawings. And so for each character that I create an avatar for them. It's what we put at the head of the chapters in the English versions, and now in the new version, the last book, we have it, so that you know who the chapter is about. So when you turn to a new chapter, you look at the avatar, and the symbol will be of a certain character, and you'll know who that character, whose point of view that chapter is in. And so for me, those are very special because they help me get into the psyche of the character. So for Arlen, the warded man, I have a hand with the first tattoo he ever put on his hand, which is an impact ward that helped him fight demons. And it was this pivotal moment that changed his life. And so that image to me really sort of represents who he is and who he became. And I have another character, Rena. She has her father's knife is like the defining thing in her life. It was part of some really horrible aspects of her life, but it also is something that's saved her life many times. And so I spent a week like researching pictures of knives and like did this like pen and ink painting of a knife, and those things help me. As I switch to a new chapter, I look at that avatar at the head of it, and that sort of helps me get in the mindset of those characters. I also draw maps of my world and mark off like how many days ride one place is to another, so I can be consistent about that, as Patty said. So that's very useful. And then one thing that I do is I have action figures on my desk, and I do play with toys, and I'm proud of it. So I have. I have more pretend friends than I have real friends, and I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only one at this table who feels that way. And so I have a Spider-Man action figure that has like 18 points of articulation, so you can bend him in any way. And
that's more than I have.
Yeah. Orson Scott Card, everyone. And so I have a few male and female action figures, and when I'm plotting out a fight scene, I will frequently use them to choreograph the fight so that I make sure that they're doing things that like a human body could do and not bending in ways that are impossible. And it really helps me write a scene in detail when I can sort of visualize it just on my desk. Plus I get to play with action figures at work.
I use my son for that.
You beat up your son?
No. I used to have my husband and my son do play fights when you
Oh, sorry.
I used to have my husband and my son do play fights so that I could write them out, and I say, wait, hold there, and they'd be bent over backwards and kind of slide, and they'd be shaking, going, what? No, what do you call that? No, I can't use that because that's kind of a modern term. What would you call that in like the Middle Ages? And they're like, oh, Patty. But it's very, very useful so that you don't put anything in there that is actually not physically possible.
And Orson, we were just discussing our first thoughts regarding the world building and some visuals, if you use ones, while thinking about new fiction. And I think the audience would love a comment.
Since I haven't heard anything said before, I hope I'm not treading on something that... Oh, that's fine. No one needs to look at me. I just got off an airplane wearing the clothes I wish I had slept in, but I didn't sleep. So if I say anything really stupid, please chalk it up to not sleeping across the Atlantic. But the only visual thing I do when I'm planning fiction is maps. I have to know where things are on a map. And many of my novels and stories have begun with a map that I just doodled and then started naming things on it. But when you talk about planning out visuals like a physical fight or something, I just have my characters get along better than yours.
I've read some of your books. I'm not sure about that.
Yes, well, most of my worlds these days, I mean, I have written about imaginary worlds, but most you draw, are your maps of imaginary places?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I see. Well,
Not real ones. Oh, no, that's work.
no, it's not. It's not work. It's great. I mean, as I said, I was talking about writing about 18th century London as a background and writing about present-day Cork as a background. But the great thing is you can actually go to the places. I can go to Cork and walk around and actually go to the restaurants and go to the pubs and then go to another pub. And I had a terrible experience in Cork, actually, which I actually put in one of my books. One of my favourite pubs was called St. Luke's Tavern. I used to go in there a lot, actually. But I had a bit of an argument with the barman because somebody came in, an old man, he came in, he said, "Oh, effing day." Actually, they use the word feck in Ireland. "What a feckin' day I've had. It's been feckin' working all hard day, and then I'd be feckin' go up the stairs and I feckin' put my head on the pillow and I feckin' fell asleep. And I didn't, and it was terrible."
Great to me.
I said to him, look, as I went up to the bar for another drink, I said, like, my wife's here. I said, do you mind cutting down the fecks by about 50%? And the barman said, for a young redhead chap from Tipperary, he said, don't you be telling our customers what to do. He said, it's up to me to do it and not you. So I said, well, feck you. And then I went back the next day, and the owner was there, and he said, you're barred. You're barred. You can't drink here anymore. So it was tragic. We had to go to the pub next door, which was run by a much more amenable chap whose name actually, truly, was Paddy Murphy. It really was. And after that, we went there ever since. But those places I have put in the books. You know, they're there, they're real, and I think, as I've said before, I think it makes it much more convincing if the place actually exists, or you've created it, as you do, Orson, to the point where you know exactly what you're talking about. You know,
I never create them that well.
Half well.
The joy of fiction is you don't actually have to know, everything. But I do the same thing that you're talking about. Yeah. Basically, I review local restaurants when I set my stories in a real setting, a contemporary setting. Then it basically becomes my restaurant reviews. I get to say what the places that are worth going to. But I use other writers' work that way. Michael Connelly sets his novels in Los Angeles, and I learned some pretty good places to eat from his stories. Of course, they're always the kind of places where policemen can afford to go. So they're not always the best restaurants, but they're always good.
That sounds brilliant. Well, certainly if you read my books, you'll know where to go in Cork and have a few drinks and fall over. They call it in Cork. They call it getting langered or wrecked. But
and Robin, I will pass on to you.
Well, I will have to admit that I am terrible at drawing maps. My publishers always have to find somebody who can take the mess I've sent them and turn it into a map. I have a kind of an odd disability. I cannot tell you how long this table is. I would have to physically get a tape measure out and measure it to even get close. So maps.
Wait a minute. It's this long.
It's this long. Yes. But it.
On the scale, it's 1 inch per inch.
6 people long. But see, this is where when I'm trying to draw things, it becomes a mess. But one of my tools that is absolutely essential to me is I make a timeline, especially when you're writing characters whose lives span several books. It's very, very important that the characters age at the same rate and that I can actually see about how much time has passed between events. I mean, how fresh is this event in the character's memory? Is he still traumatized by it? Has she totally recovered? Has she almost forgotten it? Did this event happen when this character was a very small child and has had no effect at all on her life because she doesn't, she's never known a life where that event hadn't happened. So if you are 10 years old when dragons are reintroduced into your world, that's a big deal. If you've always had dragons to contend with, that makes you a different person. So for me, my timelines are very, very important in keeping people aging at the same rate, but also in saying, who are you? How did this affect you? How much of the war do you remember? How much of this event affected your life?
I wish I did that. I start out timelines, but then I forget where I'm writing them. So I can't find them again. Oh. And so I have had to resort in multi-book series to going to my website and asking readers. I was going to write a story about Mazer Rackham at a certain point in his life, and I said, does anybody remember if I ever gave him a wife and children? Because I have no idea. And the answer was, I never said he didn't, and I never said he did. Mm-hmm. And so I was free to go. But I hate to contradict myself in the books, but I can't remember. When you're writing and you just, you're winging things. And so you mentioned that somebody had this thing in their background. I don't stop and write it down because I'm in the flow of writing. I'll remember it, and then I don't. I don't even remember it about my life. Why would I remember it about the lives of made-up people?
This is what I mean about writing shouldn't be fun. Because I do stop in the middle of writing and write that stuff down and put it in a file. It is work. That's like, this is the thing. Writing is my job. It doesn't have to be fun. I have to I have to do it well. And if that means that I have to suck all the fun out of it for myself, I make that sacrifice for you.
So I have a lot of fun when I write, but I do take note of which characters come in. They have characters that jump from one series to the other. So you have characters that appear mostly in one series, but sometimes they appear in the other. So I have to keep track of those timelines. And for a long time, actually, I had one series that ran a long time behind, was lagging way behind the Mercy series. So I had to wait till it came up. And I have a really, really, really good memory, but I don't have a really, really, really good memory enough for 17 books. That's a lot of books, and I will tell you, my readers do. If I make them, so what I do is I write them, I do the best job I can, and then I have a couple people who have no life, because apparently all they do is memorize my book. So I send them the manuscript, and I say, it is awful.
They have a wonderful life.
So I make them read it, and then and their job is to go through it, and I do pay them for this. Their job is to go through and see where I've contradicted myself, and also where maybe I should say something. So things like make sure that Mercy's necklace appears, her cat appears, that Adam's dog tags appear in the book somewhere when it's appropriate. To make sure that when she, as a not random example, borrowed a library book, that library book eventually got returned, even though I couldn't return it right at the end of it was.
Do that in real life.
Right. So I wrote the book into Silverborn, and I was writing the next book, and I was talking to my editor, and she goes, "Patty, you have to return that book." I'm going, "What book?" She goes, "The library book." Or the book on the Fae. She said, "I know why you didn't put it in the end of the book, because it didn't belong there. But," she said, "I'm really anxious about it, because we're readers, right? And books are important. And if you borrow a book, you have to give it back." And
In movies, they do the same thing.
Right.
How many times have you seen somebody open a refrigerator in a movie or a television show and walk away without closing the refrigerator?
right? It makes you crazy. You
I
just
just want to go and yell at them.
it's almost as bad as if at the beginning of a scene someone says, "I have to go to the bathroom," and then they don't go through the whole scene. They don't go to the bathroom. By the end, every member of the audience is just like this, right?
Now, if halfway through the scene you start noticing there's a dark stain on their trousers, then it's all right. But
I think we've gone really far here. Thanks. Okay, but in the second book there was no place to return the book either, but I had to mention it so that nobody felt bad. So they knew that I still knew that Mercy had the book, that she knew she had to return it. We just weren't going to do it yet. So.
One of the big problems is when you're writing a sequel in a series and real time has gone by. My character, Harry Erskine, who was a fake fortune teller who appeared as the hero in the Manitou, bless you, and in the Manitou, suddenly I wanted to write a sequel only about 2 years ago. But what had happened is that 30 years had gone by since the original story. So what do I do? I mean, originally in the story, he's 35 years old. Do I make him 65 years old? And that's very difficult. So I decided he would just be the same age. You know, I wouldn't change his age because, you know, why not? And it didn't really, it wasn't properly sequential, but it would be ridiculous to have him suddenly in the next story, you know, he becomes an old age pensioner. So that's what I did then. And quite often, the interesting thing is that, as you're saying, the readers really follow these books completely, and they believe the characters are real. They believe that Harry was a real person. I mean, it helped that Tony Curtis played him in the movie, so they got that idea of that he's a real person. But people have emailed me and said, when is Harry going to have another fight with the Red Indian demon? And I have to say, it's no good my saying, well, I'm not going to write another one, because they don't understand. I have to say, well, I rang Harry. I gave Harry a telephone call, and he told me that he's too busy in Florida reading fortunes for rich old ladies, and the last thing he wants to do in the whole world is have another fight with a Red Indian demon. So, sorry, he won't do it.
We touch upon a thing like would call it crack in the world, and as we already witnessed, it's a great opportunity to contact with the readers, to address the audience, and they may get involved in the story. And do you happen to caught yourself off guard while creating a story, and you see that you don't follow what you agreed at the very beginning of the story, Robin?
So to rephrase that, you're asking if partway through a story I suddenly changed direction, changed my mind.
Just
Change the rules. Changing the rules, if the rules are magic, no. You once you've established what the rules are, if you change it, that's cheating, and the readers will send you vast quantities of email. So you don't do that. Changing your mind about a plot. I'm a person who writes character-driven, so sometimes I will think the characters are going to do one thing, and then they won't. They do something else because it makes more sense to them. And when I think about it, I would say, oh, yes, given that character, that circumstances, they're not going to have the common sense to hide. They're going to stand up and fight. And then you have to write that scene because you have to be true to the characters. So.
Can I add to that? Just using as an example a book by Dean Koontz, which I think was called Strangers, but I'm not sure. It was 20 years ago, relatively early in his career. But it had a wonderful storyline about a whole bunch of people. He was following about 5 or 6 characters, and he wrote them all wonderfully, and I cared about them. And then all of a sudden, he remembered that he had sold an outline of this novel, and he thought he had to follow it. And so suddenly they encounter an alien spaceship, and parked on the ground somewhere, and they go inside it. And from that moment on, it doesn't matter who any of those people are. He just completely forgot how much we cared about these characters. He was driving them around to follow the outline, and you just watched them die. It was really kind of sad because he's a wonderful writer, but he apparently felt bound to his outline then. It's so much better when, as you're saying, if the characters don't want to do what you planned for them to do, find a new plan, because that's how it comes to life. In fact, my new plans often come because there's a character that I didn't know was going to be in the book. And it's just, a minor character that I kind of fall in love with, and that character moves in and pitches a tent and lives there now. And so I'm stuck with that one. So some of my readers' favorite characters are characters that are not in the outline at all. I had no plan for them.
Yeah, but you can also just make a better plan. I submitted a outline for 5 books to my publisher 11 years ago, and I followed that outline. This last book that just came out ends exactly the way that I said it was going to end, because I made the rules in the beginning and I laid them out in a careful order, and I when the plot didn't work, I reworked it. Before I even started writing the prose, I solved a lot of those story problems, so I knew where the story was going and I wouldn't paint myself into a corner at some point. So I had this sort of, the details got fuzzier the further out it got. But I certainly, I knew how everything was going to end and how everything was going to tie up 5 books into the series.
But you have to know that.
Yeah.
How do you know where to begin if you don't know where you're going to end?
Agreed.
I don't understand writing your way in, having no idea of the ending. You're just going to end up with cliche endings.
But that
No,
said...
I don't. I never know how they're going to end. I have no idea. It would be no fun.
See, that's...
Then you're a miracle.
Yeah.
Well,
I have to know what I'm aiming at before I can know.
Well, you generally know what you're aiming at, but I never know. I mean, I'm halfway through a new crime thriller at the moment. I've only yesterday thought about the whole key thing in the whole plot, which is going to solve the crime in the end. I only thought about it yesterday, and I'm already on page 171.
Now you've ruined mystery reading for me.
I would have nightmares about that.
You mean that stuff didn't really happen and you're discovering it? Oh no, you're making it up?
Same as you, dude. I very much admire the way you do your outlines, but I'd end up banging my head against the wall if I had to follow an outline as slavishly as that. Well, you do.
All the time.
Okay. Yeah, but it's no fun.
But don't you ever get bored if you know exactly what's going to happen?
Yeah, I'm bored the whole time. I'm not having fun. It's work. It's a job. They pay me to do this. I don't do it for free.
So sorry.
But that said, if you have a better idea as you're writing along, you have to go with the better idea. You don't want to be so bound by your plot that you suddenly put a spaceship where it doesn't belong. In my 4th book, there's a key pivotal moment where one of the lead characters, Leisha Paper, has to tell a lie. And the whole plot of that book sort of hinges around that lie. And when I got to that point, this was one of the few points in the whole series where it was as if the actress playing Leisha turned to me and said, "I'm not going to read that line." And absolutely, it just felt so wrong for her to tell that lie, so out of character, so against everything that I'd built about her, that it would have read wrong to me, it would have read wrong to the readers, and it would have ruined the book. And so I had to just have her blurt out the truth. But then I had to stop what I was doing, go back to the outline, and spend a month reworking the whole plot of the book and the whole outline of the book to fix that problem and rethread in her telling the truth, and then go back to writing. Because it's a job, it's not fun.
Okay, so here it is. I've written books every which way you can, because I've been writing since 1993. That's when the first book got published. So that's how long I've been writing. I've written Every Which Way You Can. The only book that ever gave me a really lot of trouble was the book I sold on outline, that I actually sat down and outlined the book. It took me as long to outline the book as it did for me to write the prequel. That was Dragon Blood. It was Raven Strike. And I finally decided that what I really do when I write a book, when I write them well, is the first draft of my book is my outline. Because when I go back, I'm the queen of the rewrite. My books are terrible. The first draft is terrible. It's awful. People start out one way, they end up another. The plot lines go, sometimes the plot lines wander around until you go, what is this book about? But I can fix anything on a rewrite, and I'm really fast at rewriting. I'm really slow that first version. And I think really what I'm doing then is a very complicated outline. But if I called it an outline, it would make me crazy, because when I was in school, and you had to write those papers, and you had to turn in an outline, and then you turn in the paper and the rough draft, and then you turn in the final draft. I would write the final draft, and then I would make a rough draft out of the final draft, and then I would go backwards, and then I would write an outline based on the paper that I had written, because I hated writing outlines so bad. Right? Right?
You can't see, the whole idea of doing drafts just makes me so weary. I learned this early on when I was just starting out. Dean Koontz wrote a book on how to write bestsellers. I didn't care about that, but what I cared about was this one piece of advice. He said, why in the world do you write a first draft? Why not start with the final draft? Why not write as if this was the only version there was going to be? And that's what I do. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that comes out of my word processor is published. What it means is that if something goes wrong with it, something that isn't working, I don't rewrite anything. I just start over and write a new first draft. Now, sometimes I start in the middle of it and write a new first draft for the rest, but I do it without referring back to a previous draft, without looking at it, because I'll always do it better the next time, but it's like always first draft, because that's the one that comes out of me in my language. And the more you fiddle with it, I've watched this with writing students of mine over and over again, that the more they fiddle with it, the worse it gets. It stops being English, because of course I don't teach in Polish, but it stops being good English. It starts being horrible. Some of my the worst writers I've worked with, if I said, okay, now I don't write a story, no dialogue, nothing, just write an outline. Just plot, to give me a synopsis on a 3x5 card, just a little note card. Instantly, their spelling problems go away. They can spell, and in English, that's a challenge for anybody. And their grammar problems go away because they're not writing, and so they're not questioning every single thing that they put down and trying to fiddle with it and fix it and revise it. And that's how paragraphs die, is by being rewritten and rewritten until they don't flow anymore. I mean, whatever comes out of you is going to be, you're fluent in your native language. You're already fluent and eloquent. And other people know what your style is the moment you open your mouth. If you have a cold and you're talking to a friend on the telephone, they still know it's you, right? Because you talk like you. And that's, if you write the way you talk, if the flavor of your language is coming out, then why in the world would you fiddle with it? If it's unclear, then you have to fix it until it's clear.
I so respectfully disagree with you.
I know most people do.
If I write a paragraph, if I thought that I was writing the final draft, I would never write a page. I have to give myself permission to be bad, to bring out the little 10-year-old that used to play princess and talking horses when I was 10, so that person can get out and play, and that's who tells the story. Then I have to put on my editor's shoes and say, okay, well, there's what we started out with. How can we turn this into something?
You have to fire the child and replace them with an older person.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. or call a different worker into place, and they have a different job to do. But I will swear to you, if I gave you my rough draft first chapter and my final draft first chapter, you would say, "Oh, Patty, I'm so glad you do revisions." So.
Whereas when I start writing each day, so I try to write 1,000 words a day, give or take. So I'll do a day's writing, and then the next day when I start, the first thing I'll do is reread the 1,000 words I wrote the day before, and I make my edits and corrections then, and then I keep flowing forward, so that the text that I'm leaving behind me is very clean and edited and presentable in a final format, but I'm free to make some mistakes moving forward because I know the next day I'll take a look at that. And that's a nice sort of bit-by-bit way to edit along the way so that you don't end up with a sloppy first draft and have to go and edit the whole thing over.
I do exactly the same as that. I write what I've written the day before. I never stick to how many words should I write. Should I write 1,000 or 2,000? So many new writers say, "Well, I've managed to write 3,000 words today." It doesn't depend on how many words you've written. It depends on how you develop the story as it goes along. But I'm the same as you, and I do correct what I wrote yesterday first thing in the morning and then carry on. I never write a first or second drafts. When I get to the end of the book, I get in touch with my publisher, I press a button, and I send the book off. Simple as that. And I don't read my own books, apart from having corrected them as I've gone along. And I've never had any trouble with that. And sometimes the publisher will want an outline, but I'll send them an outline after I've written the book, so they can use it to promote the book then. But really, you're absolutely right about, it's your own voice coming out. It's you talking. And to me, writing is like writing music. It should come out just so that people can hear it, just like they hear music, without being aware that you're there. It's just your voice coming out, and they can just listen to it, just like they listen to music, and they're not really aware that they're reading something that's been corrected and corrected again and again, a first and second. I'm always amazed when people say, "I've just written my third draft," and I say, "What's the matter with you?"
Why do you keep writing the same book over and over?
Yeah, go and write
Why haven't you written 3 books in that time instead of 3 drafts?
Exactly. Well, I wrote 3 novels last year, and that was not enough.
You're making the rest of us look bad.
My approach is a bit different, and I will quote something from my friend Vonda McIntyre, who says to anybody out here who wants to be a writer, there is no wrong way to write your book. You're always going to write it your way. What I do is I write very chronologically, chapter 1 to the end of the book, and I'm writing along, and I'll suddenly get to chapter 4 and say, if I want him to betray, and this is an example I often use, if I want to betray her hiding place by having her have a sneezing fit, I have to mention somewhere earlier in the book that she's horribly allergic to lavender and that lavender is growing in this garden. So then I open what I call my go back file on my computer. And in the go back file, I will make a note that says, somewhere prior to chapter 5, mention the lavender in the garden in the sunlight and mention that she's allergic. And then I just keep going. And when I do my cleanup, that's when I go to the go back file, and it tells me everything I need to weave into the book to make it flow smoothly. But I try not to stop that flow of telling the story, even though I know I need to go back and add these little bits and pieces. And that's what works for me. But there's no wrong way to write your book.
Sure. That would make me crazy. I would have to go back and fix that right away. Really? I couldn't just leave that to sit. It would eat at me.
I'm with him.
But that's exactly your point, isn't it? That you do what you need to do in order to be able to move on.
Exactly.
Right, that would make me crazy. I have to fix it. Occasionally, if I'm editing something, and I'm going through and suddenly realize that I forgot to mention something, and I'm in editing so that I'm going a lot faster, then I will take a piece of paper and I'll just write this down. Chapter 4, I have to put this in. But I will do that day. I just maybe can't stop right then. But that's as good as I get, because I know if I have a go back chapter, I will never look at that file. It will never, I will just never look at it. The same thing goes with, I know people who save when they have to delete scenes or they delete chapters or they have things go wrong, because those of us who do not outline, we write a lot more words than we need to. Because sometimes you follow your intuition and you get to a point and you go, oh, that would never work, and then you have to jump back. And I don't do it as badly as I used to, but the first 2 or 3 books, I threw away hundreds of pages. And for a while, I would put them in a separate file because it felt so bad to take off these precious gems that have flowed from my fingertips. And I would put them away. And about the 4th book, I realized I never opened those files. So then I gave myself permission to put things, if I have to delete it and it really makes me feel bad, I can put things in there and I can go back and grab them, even though I know I never will. And about the 6th or 7th book, then I quit even doing that. I would just get rid of them and...
No. Now, see, that's your mistake. Someday there's going to be some poor graduate student desperate to find more material. And if you have those old discarded sections, that's a dissertation per book.
I've
Come
read
on.
The Silmarillion. I will never do that. Never.
Patty brings up a very good point, though. I mean, my first attempt at writing The Painted Man, I made it up as I went along. I did not write an outline. And it was bad as a result. I painted myself into a corner. The book ended up in a place that I didn't want it to end up in. It didn't work. It didn't flow properly. And I didn't understand what was wrong with it or how to fix it until I spoke to my now agent, and we sort of went through it, and he said, look, the problem is you made it up as you went along. And I ended up throwing out 60% of that book, just keeping sort of the core, like, Arlen origin story, and then rebuilding the rest of the book as a skeleton, just as a bulleted list of what happens until and I kept pecking away at that until I felt that skeleton was like Wolverine strong, like adamantium strong. And only then did I start writing again, and I've written that way ever since, and it's worked for me because I felt horrible throwing away so much material because I didn't do my homework up front.
To me, it's like a diet. It's just like a diet. Throw away that 100 pounds and go on to leaner, better, fitter, prettier, and don't worry about it.
Throw away 100 pages. You're not serious about writing.
Right?
Yeah.
So 100 pages of man?
Well, so you do it right the first time.
That's practically a whole novel. Well, I can tell you something. I've been listening to this, and I think one of the most interesting things about you keep talking about making mistakes. I think with the great advantage that I've had, and I was very lucky for this to happen, was I got kicked out of school when I was 17 years old. And I'd been to a boys' school, and it was all boys, but my parents moved, and suddenly I found that I was in a school with girls. I was 17 years old, and suddenly Shakespeare and Byron and Wordsworth did not seem very interesting anymore. And I spent every day talking to Jane and Charmian and Jill, and that was how I went on from then. Later on, once I was kicked out of school, I became a trainee newspaper reporter. And if I can be very quick with this, but the first job I was sent out on, my first day, 17 years old, was to interview a woman about her husband who had won a cycling prize. And I talked to her about her boring husband's cycling prize. But
I don't understand the word. What prize?
Cycling.
Cycling. Oh.
Bicycling, sorry. I will try and speak more clear.
I was hearing citing, and I had no idea how you would win a prize for citing.
Citing. Well, I suppose you could do. I don't know.
Recycling.
Cycling. Sorry, I was speaking more clearly. Okay. Yeah, but just as I was leaving the house, the woman said to me, "He beats me." And I said, "What?" I said, "Do you want to talk about it?" And so we went back into the living room, and she told me how her husband regularly beat her. And if she cooked something that he didn't like, he would throw it against the kitchen wall. She'd been to her sister saying how badly her husband treated her, and her sister said, well, it was your fault for marrying him. And she'd been to her parents, and they'd said very much the same thing. She talked to me for about an hour and a half. There I was, 17 years old, and I'd asked her a few questions, and she said, "What can I do?" And I said, "Well, there's nothing I can do really to help you. But what I realized as I left there, as I bicycled away, or even cycled away, was that I was like Saul on the road from Damascus. It was like a flash of light. I suddenly realized that if I could talk to people as a sympathetic stranger, somebody who could listen to them and understand them without them being worried that it was going to get back to their friends or their husband, then I could ask them anything and they would tell me anything. And all through my journalistic career as a newspaper reporter and later as a magazine editor, that's what I did. I talked to people and they told me absolutely everything about their lives. So when it came to creating characters, and this is why I find it easier anyway, to make characters that don't have to be corrected, is because I'm relying on the information that I got from real people, that they really told me about the most distressing things that ever happened in their lives.
And I think it's going directly to my question regarding the level of detail while designing a character that you are allowing yourself. Orson?
I don't actually design my characters because in the real world, you don't really know anybody, right? I mean, you think you do. Like most of you think you know your mom. You know who she is, what she'll say, except I don't know anybody who has never had the experience of hearing their mother say something and go, who is this woman? Because it's so completely out of what you think her character is. We don't know anybody. The only characters we ever know are the ones we make up in fiction, because they can never change. You know, once it's written down in the fiction and it's published and it's done, then they do things for the reasons that the author said. And so we have kind of a responsibility. We're creating characters that you can actually understand, unlike real people that you're never sure of. And so when I'm writing a character, I find myself rebelling against my own plans because better stuff comes up along the way. They come up with a smart alecky answer that really isn't true to some outline of my character, but it's what I need them to say. Maybe it's just because all of my characters are secretly me, but but we don't even know ourselves, do we? I mean, haven't you ever had the experience, I think everyone here has, of thinking back on something that happened long ago, and you go, oh, now I understand why I said that. Now I understand. You thought you knew at the time. You thought you understood yourself, but you didn't. And that's the way it is when we're coming up with characters, is that they'll do some things and then I'll go, oh, wait, now I know why he did that. So I'll have the character realize the same thing. And so they change and they transform. So I kind of rebel at the thought of having to plan out my characters, especially in a world where a lot of people think characterization means describing them. If you read any of my books carefully, you'll discover that barring some physical disfigurement that matters, I never describe my characters, ever. It drives them crazy when they're trying to come up with an illustration, so Tor just puts spaceships on the cover and then they don't have to worry about it. I just don't waste time physically describing them unless there's some attribute that matters in the way that they live. If they're really short and they have to suffer with the suffering that happens to people who are as small of stature, then sure, I'll tell you that they're short. But beyond that, none of the other things matter. What matters is what they do and why they do it. And it's mostly the why they do it. It's motive. It's all motive. And when you start understanding what your characters want, why they respond to the things, what's going on in their hearts and their lives. But I can't plan that because I find it out when I see what they do and why they do it. And so even if I have a tightly outlined story, that doesn't tell me anything about the motives that each character will have. Nobody ever does anything for just one reason, and nobody ever has just one response to an event that happens. So I think that winging it with character is vital to me, even though I do have some key events that I know have to happen.
can I quickly say is I knew my mother.
Well, it's easy, if you say new.
Yes, I knew my mother, and my father was some soldiers. But but when it comes to, one thing I do describe is what people wear. I tend to do that a lot because how somebody is dressed, what clothes they put on, is a very, very quick key to how they think about themselves and what image they want to present to the world. So I may not describe them in huge detail. I mean, if they've got a wooden leg or something, I'll put that in. But generally, I do try and say something about what they're wearing because it's an instant assessment of at least how they want to be seen in the world.
I think that I put in enough detail that I want the reader to feel that they're really in the world and getting to know the character. And one of the little tests I do for myself, if I am describing like a room or a new character, I will say, how many of the reader's senses have I engaged? Can they see something? Can they hear something? Is there a texture mentioned? Is there a smell? And trying to bring all the senses in to that first paragraph when you're first stepping into the room or first meeting the character. I think that's one way to really fully engage the reader, especially the sense of smell, which is often something that we don't use in descriptive writing, but is one of our most powerful memory triggers.
I think of my books as sort of character studies through a sort of pivotal moment in my made-up history. And what I like to do with my most important characters is I start with them as children. So in each of my books, I'll take a different character or a couple of different characters and go back in time to when they were children, and usually something will happen to them where they don't have any agency. Something happens to them because they're children and they don't understand it, or they don't have the tools or the agency to make their own decisions in life, and something is forced upon them. And those moments define who they become as adults. And so when you see a character as a child and you see these sort of defining moments for them, and then I jump ahead years and you see them as an adult and they encounter a similar problem to what they encountered as a child, you understand why they react the way they react. You understand what has changed about them inside that makes them behave a certain way or refuse to do something or insist on doing something. So I try and put the reader right in the front seat, right in the driver's seat as all of that is happening, so that they feel they know the character, or sometimes they can even feel as if they are the character. They can put the character on like a suit and know how they're going to behave. For descriptions, like sometimes I'll give a rough description of what someone looks like, but I don't really think that that's nearly as important as the key motivating things about them that make them do what they do. I've gone on too long.
So I don't outline, but I do decision trees for the major characters in a book before I start the book. A decision tree is where you take a character and you go, okay, what kind of character do I need? So for the Mercy Thompson series, I knew it was going to be a series of books. It's the first book I wrote that I knew was going to be a series. And I knew it was going to be urban fantasy, and there were some things I wanted to do. I wanted a character who was really grounded in the real world, that there were real things that she had to do. She had to go to work every day, or else she would lose her house, and to add tension to the story. I needed her to be not as powerful as the other characters she was coming up against, because to me, that makes my life a lot easier as a writer, because I can put her in jeopardy, I can put her in danger, and people believe she's in danger if she's not Superwoman, if there's something, or Superman, depending on the character. So I start with a character who's underpowered. Well, I knew I was writing urban fantasy with werewolves and vampires. And I grew up in Montana, and in the US, if you have wolves, the automatic underdog to a wolf is a coyote. So I said, okay, so she's going to be a coyote shapeshifter, and immediately I have all of this lore that comes to my head because I know a lot about Native American stories, and I know that shapeshifters are part of Native American heritage. That's just something that they see the world differently than we of European extraction do, that they see themselves as part of the world instead of apart from the world. So if you were Native and you were walking in the forest and somebody came up to you, looked just like you, and then he said, "No, I'm a bear," they would believe him. And it would not destroy their world to see this bear walking in a human suit in the woods. And frequently, one of the things that their holy people can do, and holy is kind of it's not the right word, but it's as good as we get. Can do is they can take the shapes of other animals. So having a shapeshifter as Native American is not outside Native American rules, if you want to use that word. And so immediately I have a woman who's Native. And I did not want to make the series about the Native American peoples because there's oh, so sorry. It's too much fraught about that. So the decision was that she was Native American, but she was not raised in the Native American culture, which is true for many, many, many Native Americans. So that was not a cheat. And I figured that would be something, a line I could follow later on, and I did, that she would figure out what her heritage was and work around that. I wanted to give her, like I said, I wanted to give her a job. She had to get up and work every day, something very hands-on. And so I made her a VW mechanic. And later on, that became very important because Mercy is a person who fixes things that go wrong in the world. And that's what mechanics do, is they make things right. They make things run smoothly. And since she was a coyote shapeshifter, she's also an agent of chaos because coyote in the Native American mythology is a creature of chaos and change. So those two dynamic forces made her, for me as a writer, a very interesting character full of a lot of story impetus, a lot of motivation. So that's the kind of decision tree you make. And one decision is, because she's a woman in in a job that's traditionally a male job, that gave me a lot of things about her character. So most of the people she knows are men. She's much more comfortable in the company of men than she is in women, and that's something she works through in her series. So this kind of decision tree, what you decide right at the beginning makes a lot of more decisions for you along the way. So when I write a character, I need to know their history, their background, what their story is for the main characters. The minor characters will work in, and there's a great freedom in writing a series because it means that I don't have to tell readers everything I know about the character when the character walks on screen. So I can make them really despise somebody, really hate somebody, knowing that I know a lot more about them and what makes them tick, and that if everybody knew what I know about them, they'd like them a lot more. But I don't need to tell you that yet. So I can do that like 4 books down the line. Suddenly you go, oh, I really like that person. And it makes the story much more fun. So that's what I mean by decision tree. Now I'm going to shut up.
We are finishing in 10 minutes less, but I think that it would be nice to have a Q&A session. So anyone from the audience? Right. Oh.
Anyone who can speak loudly.
Oh, no, I will throw the mic to you.
I'll try to catch.
Could you raise your hand, please, once again?
I have a question. We went from the world building to character creation and developing the character. So I would like to go back to world building for a little bit of rules. I'm really interested in fantasy and magic mostly. So I would like to know how you make borders in making magic. Like, okay, you can throw, let's say 3 fireballs, but 4th fireball you can't, and why? So, example.
I give you permission to make your magic system any way you like, but be consistent once you've made it. And you have to know in your heart why. I love to play with biology in magic. So if I say, I have a dragon, it's this big. I look around at real-life meat eaters of a certain kind, and I say, how much territory does this dragon need? How often does it need to eat? what's it going to prey on? How does that affect the other creatures in that world? What is the temperament of a carnivore of that size? So I do a lot of taking my magical creature or system and grounding it to real rules that I know in this world. I know that if we're moving big stones in a wheelbarrow, there's going to be a limit to how often you can trundle that wheelbarrow up the hill. So if magic is requiring a certain amount of physical or mental exertion, then you say, okay, so how, you know, it's like the D&D rules. How many spells can you carry in your head? Or how, and just, you know, you create those rules. And as long as you are consistent with them, your reader will say, oh, okay, I'll step into that world and I'll believe what you've said.
All of which I agree with completely. The thing I'd like to just add is, if you think of it as what is the price of magic, what is the cost to the magic wielder? If the cost is none, then you've created God. You know, you've created a character who essentially can do whatever they want and without paying any price, which is really boring to read about, by the way. So you have to think back to when Superman was first introduced. He could do anything and nothing could hurt him. And so readership was great for a little while, and then by the end of the first year, readership was falling off. And then they thought of Krypton. Now, Krypton is not a good, you know, it's just a weakness. It's not a price of magic. But if magic costs the wielder of magic something, that's really helpful. May I also suggest that you, for one thing, forget all Dungeons and Dragons material, because it's clear that your fireballs come out of that tradition, and maybe they work on screen. I don't think so. I really don't think that works in fiction. But what are the people who aren't wielding magic doing? Most fantasies seem to be set in a pre-technological civilization, because if you have microwaves, why do you need magic? If you have cell phones, why do you need magic? So I know, we still need magic. I wish for it more than you. But when you're writing something set in a pre-technological society, what are other people doing for their day job? That's why I loved you talking about having your character be a mechanic. There's a book, two books that I've used. One of them is quite recent, but one of them I've been using for 30 years. The old one is called The Lost Country Life, which is never going to be translated into Polish, but here you are listening to us speak English, so clearly that won't terrify you. But The Lost Country Life is just going through a year in a medieval village. What are all the jobs that people have to do? By the time I was through reading that, I thought, good heavens, their life was so much harder and required so much more intelligence than getting a mere PhD. That I would have more respect for anybody who can do all that stuff that they do. A more recent book is called Craft, C-R-A-E-F-T, by a fellow who does, an archaeologist who does a program on the BBC, which I've never seen in America, but I love his book because he actually works on doing medieval crafts. He actually figured out why sometimes you need a sickle and sometimes you need a scythe when you're harvesting grain, depending on how ripe it is. That you want a sickle when it's so heavy, when it's so ripe that if you jostle it too much, the seeds will fall and you'll lose them. And now I'm reading one on Aborigines who may well have. It's called Dark Emu. And it transforms our idea completely of we realized how much propaganda we've had about how primitive the Australian Aborigines are, when in fact they had a highly advanced civilization based around agriculture that made use of the worst land in the world, which is basically the outback of Australia. And they were feeding large populations from what they could grow on land that now can't even feed sheep. And if you can't feed sheep, it's dead. So these books give you an idea of what regular people are actually doing when the powerful people come by. If you don't know that, I don't think you have a story. You need to know how the world works for everyday people, and then introduce the magic that will change and transform some of that. But if everybody's getting everything made by wizards, then who cares what happens? I mean, it's only if you see people struggle and work and have a price to everything they do, the cost to it, that I feel like the world is interesting enough to have stories in it. Sorry, little sermon, now I'm done.
The second question? On your left.
When you know the book is finished and ready to publish?
Peter, I think this is a question for you.
I had a great answer for the magic question. Maybe we'll get to that someday. It's hard. I wrote 4 books before I published one. And those 4 books, I refused to even try to publish because I knew they weren't good enough. And this is the thing that I think a lot of new writers don't understand, is that you don't just write. I mean, maybe someone here has a different story, but most of the writers I know have a few books in the trunk. They have a few books that were their practice books. You know, the first time you play the piano, you don't record it. The first time that you write a book, you don't try and sell it. And so I wrote my first book at 17. It was terrible. I would never, ever, ever try and sell it or show it to anyone.
Of course, you realize that now I have to read that.
I systematically hunted down every copy of it and destroyed them. I have one on my hard drive that's encrypted. You need like a Mission Impossible to get that from me. But I've written a few others, and again, I felt like I would get to the end of the book and I would say, I like this book. I learned a lot writing about it. There are things in this book that I'm really proud of, but there are also some real weaknesses that I have to admit, and maybe fixing them would be more work than just writing another book.
Can you read that sign?
The end? Oh. Be your own harshest critic.
Thank you. I will try to be quick. I think my question kind of touches the thing that you talked about. Like, what do you do if you have those moments when you have a piece of work and you just don't know what to do with it? And I'm not talking specifically about, burning out, like I don't know what to do anymore. Just like you have stories, you have characters, and like you don't really know what do you want to do with them. I think the first thing that I have heard about it from the writer's perspective is like in the Dark Tower from Stephen King. Like you don't really know what do you want to do with those characters, with this world, and what do you do?
There is a way to jumpstart that, and I've resorted to it just a couple of times, not necessarily for publication, but simply to make them do something, and that is to say, what is the worst thing that can possibly happen to these characters? Then you make... Short of death. Then you make it happen, and you watch them scurry around and run for cover, and you learn a lot about them. And you don't necessarily put that in the book, but you think about it. And
It must have been horrible to the ants living
it's the chickens. But it's one way to activate your characters or story. And the other thing is to say to yourself as a writer, I can write anything, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and I don't have to keep it. And I can't, from speaking for myself, I can't write it well until I have written it really bad. So once you've written it and you hate it and it's really bad, you can say, how do I fix this? And then you can fix it.
Some of us spend our whole careers doing that and get all of our bad stuff published, and then keep trying to get it right.
I really wish I had an unpublished novel somewhere in a drawer somewhere. I just don't. yesterday, my publisher sent me the cover for my next crime book, which I'm on. It's all ready to go. Cover's all ready to go. I'm still on page 173. I just don't.
You figured out how it ends.
Not exactly. The only unpublished book I've got, in which I will finish it one day, but it's a humorous book about two brothers who form a rock group called the Disappointment Brothers. And actually, the real title is If Pigs Could Sing. And it's about these two brothers in America who find out that pigs can actually sing, and pigs love Beethoven. And when they actually start their own band and they go to the Grand Ole Opry and start singing, in the background they have pigs singing in a choir, and it's a hilarious book, and it's got lots of songs in it, lots of amusing incidents and things like that. But I've never quite got around to finishing it, but I shall.
Well, you need to record the album.
Maybe my first book isn't so bad.
For what it's worth, I know it's the end, but for what it's worth, my advice to people who suffer from writer's block or who don't know what to do to get on with the story is usually, I think that's a symptom that unconsciously you don't believe in or don't care about something that you just wrote. And so go back and think, why else might this character have done this? Who else might have reacted differently to this? And just, I call it elsing a story. And you go back and see what else the possibilities might have been. You'll come up with a lot of really crappy ones that don't help a bit, but you also come up with some that are really good, and they'll wake it up for you again. They'll wake you up to the potential in the story. And that's why I tell my students, don't ever write through writer's block and keep trying to force it, because you already don't believe in what you've just done. So go back and redo it, so that you are writing a new first draft, but writing through it again, and what will happen is that it'll be much more lively the next time, because it just wakes you up.
Very quickly, I will say. Very quickly.
Did anyone here say they were great at ending?
Yes. No, I will say just one word about what you've just said, Orson, and that is, I always used to think for a long time that writer's block was actually a building.
It's a Lego.
Writers were sitting in this building staring at their computers and going... And that's the end.
I really hate to do this, but this is the end, unfortunately. Huge applause to our guests.